Good afternoon. This is the final panel of the day, and immediately after us will be the last keynote speaker. I'm Stephanie Norby, and I'm the director of the Smithsonian Center for Learning and Digital Access, and I'm privileged to moderate this final session, which is looking at how do we measure impact. Researchers calculate that there are 295 exabytes of information, and I have no idea what that means. But evidently, what it means is that's 315 times the number of grains of sand in the world. So one of the things we're looking at is, with all of this information, what does it mean? What difference does it make in how we live in our leisure time, in our work, and how we learn? And so that's what our panel is going to be looking at today, with each of the panelists looking at it from a different point of view. We're going to start with a very big picture, and we're fortunate to have Harry Verwayen here, who is the Deputy Director of Europeana. He's responsible for the strategy, business development, and impact assessment of Europeana. He is currently working on the launch of a community of professionals who are working on impact design, assessment, and narration. And this includes a publication of a free open source framework for impact assessment. I had a chance to look at a draft of this, and it's really quite exceptional, and I know it will be of interest to the field. We're going to follow that with Madlyn Runburg, and she is the Director of Education Initiatives at the Natural History Museum of Utah. And Madlyn is focused on the development of technology-enabled learning experiences that support the development of critical thinking skills. She is currently managing a project called Research Quest, which is engaging middle school teachers and students in authentic virtual investigations. And this pilot program has been envisioned as a way for museums to not only increase access, but to start to understand the difference that it makes and its impact on youth. And I'd like to mention that Ricardo Punzalan was unable to join us today, but we're very fortunate to have Diana Marsh, who has worked with him on his research, and she will be standing in for him. Diana is the postdoctoral fellow at the National Anthropological Archive at the National Museum of Natural History, and she is very focused on the digitization of ethnographic collections and its use by Native peoples. So we have three very different examples of impact, and I look forward to their presentations.
Right. Good afternoon. I'm very pleased to be here. My name is Harry Verwayen. I'm from Europeana. I flew over the pond yesterday evening. I'm very proud to be here. I'm actually mildly nervous. I'm 47. I've done a couple of these presentations, but tonight, this is tonight in Europe, my mom's watching on the so I got to do this. Hi, Mom. All right, you've been deprived of a break, so I'm going to do a little mind game with you, just for starters. So I'm inviting you to look at this picture. There is an animal somewhere in that picture. I'm wondering if you can see it. All right. Interesting. All kinds. Yeah. All right. So the whole game is, of course, to make you realize that if we flip it around, maybe you now see something. No? No? I heard the right answer, actually, in the previous question. A cow? Very good. Are you Dutch? No? Okay. Because cows are really important to us. But indeed, there is a cow in this. Do you see it now? No, you still don't see it. Okay, so the whole point of this is to show you, this is to illustrate a point. Because I flipped it around, you've probably been looking at the darker sides of the image. On the top, you may have been fantasizing about birds here because they're dark and in the back and they have similar traits. But indeed, there is a cow in there, but it's captured here in the whiter sides. Do you see this? Ear, eye, snout. Yeah, right. Yeah, that's it, right. Thank you, my mom will appreciate that. All right. So the point I want to illustrate with this is that, like with impact, sometimes impact is staring you right at the face, and you just don't see it. And more often than not, you will see something and someone else will see something else. We're not aligned in this. And to me, that was the biggest design problem my team wanted to face and really wanted to find an answer for. So how can we align ourselves when we talk about impact, that we actually talk about the same thing, that we are able to capture that in a meaningful way and actually create more of it, because that's the whole point. We want to create more impact. So I'm very proud today to announce that we have developed a methodology. I didn't do it by myself. There's a whole team out there, hopefully also watching. And I'm going to take you in a little teaser video just to show you what it's about. Okay, so just to show you that this is the way that we look at impact. It should also be a joyful thing. It's not something we should be depressed about. It's great, and it's fun to investigate it. So what is it about? The book that we're releasing today, you can find it on impact.tools. We've tried to make it very practical so that everyone can use it. So it consists of a number of chapters. There are 3 workshops involved, a bit of homework in between. There are tools in there that we've developed specifically for our industry, so the cultural sector, museums, libraries, and archives. To get to grips with this, there are some free downloads. There's a step-by-step approach to take you by the hand and walk you through this. And we really think, and we designed it to make sure that everyone, whether you have a large budget, or whether you use Smithsonian or the Drents Archief, which is a small archive in my country, the Netherlands, you should be able to do this by yourselves, at least the strategic part, because we think that is the most important one to consider first. And so the end result, if you read this book and you go through the steps, and this is not a cookbook that you should follow, by the letter. Look at this as a Jamie Oliver cookbook where you throw in a couple of ingredients and make something. You make a nice dish for yourself. That's really the important part. But you should end up with something that looks like this, a spreadsheet, some questions that you really want to pose to address whether you have impact in the area that you're interested to have impact in, what kind of questions you want to ask yourselves or your audiences, and how you're going to measure that. So that is the proposition I'm laying out to you at the moment. I want to take this opportunity also to thank my team. They've worked their butts off to get this right for today. So Julia Fallon, Julia Shannonberg, Panos, Nick, and Nicholas, I want to give you a big hand. Thank you very much for doing this. They're also watching, so thank you. This book was developed in practice. This is not a theoretical exercise. We tried it out on a number of projects that we're doing at Europeana and in our network. So I want to take you through one of those case studies just to show you how that works. So the case at hand here is a project we've developed called Europeana 1914-1918, which is of course about the Great War which raged in Europe in that period. So what was that project about? We worked with Oxford University in 2011, and it started in the UK, where we invited people in the region of Sussex to come to national libraries or to the regional libraries and museums to share their stories about the Great War in the form of diaries, postcards, letters, photographs, anything that people would still have in their attics, remembering them of that period. And it was combined with the digitized collections of large institutions such as the Austrian National Library, the Dutch National Library, etc. So you had the institutional resources, but the real impact we found was in the people themselves, you know, ordinary people like you and me, bringing these stories to these libraries. So it looks like this. This woman here is called Elżbieta Zobiak. She comes from Poland. She's one of the many. We had 8,000 people like that across Europe in 24 countries who shared their stories with us, sometimes very emotional. In this case, it was about this gentleman, which was her grandfather, Bronislaw Zobiak, who was injured in Verdun in the summer of 1916, and probably lucky for him because he survived the war, but he was apparently very traumatized, and that story kept on living throughout Elżbieta's youth and history, and it was a big thing for her to share that. But she was very adamant that she wanted to share this story for the future generations so that everyone could see what this war really did to people. So we had anecdotal evidence. Many anecdotal evidences that there was impact. There were tears. We've also had a lot of press attention in many countries. So we sensed there was something there, but it wasn't systematic. It was still anecdotal. So we started to design our own impact assessment, and we started conceiving of that into 4 parts. So the first part was really the design of the impact assessment itself. And what are the things that we really want to know? So we proposed ourselves, we had many definitions that we found, and actually we drilled it down to the most basic one. When we think about impact, we think about it as changes that occur for our stakeholders or society as a result of certain actions or activities. To me, this is the most pure form, the pure definition of impact that we can find. Our work contributes to big societal issues, and I think that's the thing that we should really be looking for. So then we started using this tool that we developed to make this big thing a bit more manageable, because this tool, which we started calling the change pathway, it's an adaptation of things that you could find in impact assessments in other sectors, really helps you to break down the big issue into components. So how does that work? This is a real simple representation of the bigger work that's behind it, but we knew what kind of resources it took to run these collection days, as we called them. There was a website. The outputs were digitized letters, diaries, resources, of course, all made available in a very open format. We also had the numbers for it. We knew it cost about 200,000 euros a year, not negligible money. It's an investment that we're making with societal money. What kind of return could we expect from that? So, I'm skipping the most important thing. Shared European identity we came as the most important impact that we would like to have. And that's a big thing. In Europe, it's a huge thing. We're being scattered into very small pieces, and there was this feeling, can we contribute to a shared feeling of identity? So the missing link was what kind of long-term and short-term outcomes, changes to real people, could we expect from this project, and what kind of questions could we ask these people to find out if we had that impact in this area? So the questions we had in mind was, is there an increased awareness of similarities between people, whether you're on one side of the trenches or the other? Is there an increased sense of learning about the war? Is there an increased sense of community? Those type of questions. We boiled it down into 30 questions which we asked ourselves, and we found also that we were drawing what we call an accountability line here. When we talk about impact, we talk about big, lofty things, but we shouldn't expect that we, by ourselves, will be able to do all that, but we can contribute to it. But did it really make a difference where you draw that accountability line, what kind of things you want to find out? So in our next phase, in the assessment phase, we created a survey. We were lucky, we had 5,000 email addresses of people who contributed. We put control groups in place. We had 1,509 valid responses, from which we started drawing conclusions. And the drawing conclusions brought us to what we call the narration phase. Just having data doesn't mean anything. What kind of stories can we extract from that are meaningful, scientifically sound, and still tell that story that we want to see? So we packaged all that in a report and a small film. You can find all of that also on impact.tools, that website that I talked to you about. And I'm just going to highlight two things from it, the two most important results, in my opinion. So the first one was a very positive one. If you remember that shared European identity was a big thing for us, that we wanted to know whether we achieved something, the results were very positive. The questions we asked, things like increased sense of community, awareness, understanding of the war, close to 70% gave us a very high rating on a scale from 0 to 10. Yes, all of this participation into this project gave us all of that, and we could lump that into a contribution to shared European identity. So that was great news for us, and we thought, maybe we can do something more with that. But there was also a defect that came out. This was an unintended impact that we were investigating. People learned a lot less from the project than we hoped for, and then that they hoped for. So the bar on the left tells you that a lot of people expected to learn a lot from being part of this project. You can imagine this is a unique database. Nowhere else would you be able to find perspectives from 24 different countries on that war. It's an amazing repository. Yet people indicated that they didn't learn enough from it. So when probing down under it, we found something that is actually quite on the surface. All these manuscripts, these letters, they were handwritten in the trenches in 24 different languages. Now that is not an easy thing for anyone to deal with. So this brought us to the final stage. How do we evaluate and how do we learn from this, which is the crucial component, in my opinion, about impact assessment, because you want to create more from it. So we took the positives. Diane was talking about how important it is that we contribute to real big societal issues. 1418 was one of those, but it was a long time ago. We're currently facing big crises around the whole migration thing in Europe. People feeling very hostile to the whole idea. We think we can do something about it, and we can take the powerful elements of collection days in order to change something in the mindset of European people, we believe. So we are designing a new project which will launch in 2018 around the subject of migration. But we also needed to do something about the problem we had about learning. So we designed a new tool, which we called Transcribathon. And Transcribathon allows people to literally transcribe the handwritten letters into something that is machine readable and therefore translatable, and do all kinds of things with it. But its package is not just a tool, it's also packaged in a format that invites people to come to those same libraries that I talked to you about before. There's a little gaming element in it. And this will allow us to transcribe all this material, we hope, and make that database really as useful as people should hope for. Now, what I want to leave you with is that, again, there's an unexpected impact, a potential impact here. Early indications of Transcribathon show us that there's a very odd segment of people very interested in using Transcribathon. So what we expected was, elderly people, who had lots of time on their hands, be very willing to help us transcribe this material. But oddly enough, school children of the age of 15 and 17, under guidance of their teacher, of course, a begeistert teacher, are super enthusiastic about it. And we haven't done any research on it of any substance yet, but what I find very surprising and super interesting is that people of 15 and 17 who have an attention span, a social media attention span of a number of seconds, are actually pulled in by the fact that they need to spend hours on a letter. And it's sort of the slow food equivalent in library world is what I'm imagining it to be. So we think that there's something really powerful here. So I want to conclude this. I hope that I spurred a bit of interest in you in using this framework as a language for us to continue talking about impact. And I thank you for your attention.
I'm Madlyn Runburg. I'm with the Natural History Museum of Utah, and I'm excited to be here talking with you today, especially after listening to so much great work going on in our field. I'm going to take a turn to something much more specific, and I think our project is focused quite differently than a lot of what we've been listening to. So I hope there are at least some educators out there who will be excited about what I'm going to share. I've been working since 2013 on this project called Advancing Critical Thinking, and our interests as a museum were really around, okay, there's this mass digitization movement. Well, we have, as an educator, more objects to use for education, yay, but what do we really know about using objects for learning? And especially coming from a programming background, how do we scaffold learning experiences that use these collection objects in a way that get us to a designed endpoint, a particular measurable impact? And so that interest coincided with a wonderful opportunity we had with a group of funders who came forward and said, y'all are doing great work on your face-to-face programs with kiddos, you're engaging lots of young learners, you're doing wonderful things with school children. We're really interested in how we can work together with you to do more of that in a technology-enabled space, thinking that we could reach more learners in that way. So before I get started talking with you about that project, I would be remiss to not right up front say that this project has been made possible through the collaboration of many expert colleagues, partners. Some of our partners have included hundreds of school teachers, thousands of students, wonderful advisors, technology experts, and so forth. I'm glad to talk with you about any of that later. Let's see. Okay, so this project that we came together with our funder on, it had a very specific end goal, which was produce a program, a technology-enabled program, that could enhance critical thinking skills in young people. And we had the privilege of exploring this very broadly. Again, like I mentioned, our interest was in how do we better use our collections objects in these spaces for learning. And so the criteria we developed in agreement with our funders included a program that would meet each of these items, including measurable impact, which was exciting for us because up until now, we've really looked at success as being programs that were taken up by our learners, where learners engaged, but not necessarily the deep research necessary to see the type of learning that happened with our programs. So that was an exciting move for us. Fast forward through an extensive research design process, and we came up with a program concept that we call Research Quest. And our idea is this: if we can take our scientists in our museum, objects from our collections, and the research that surround those objects, could we create authentic online investigation students? And that was a strategic decision for us to go after students. We thought with a lot of the changing science standards and our nearly 50-year history working with school audiences that we could be a good support to teachers in this space with these types of resources. So could we take those three components and produce these online investigations that gave students opportunities to practice their critical thinking skills, or if you were a teacher, you might think of them as science process skills. If you're an ELA teacher, you might think of them as argumentation. but these higher order thinking skills that students work on across the curriculum, seen through the lens of our science and our objects. And so with this idea in mind, serving K-12 with these online investigations, we knew we needed to test the idea. So we created 3 pilots, and we had a lot of enthusiasm from one of our paleontologists who is featured in these investigations. So we took our pilot initially into middle school. So these 3 pilot investigations are designed for middle school students, and they're designed to be incredibly easy and flexible for teachers to use with their students. Now, what we did here is we took our Cleveland Lloyd dinosaur quarry site, which is a world-renowned site because like 12,000 dinosaur bones have been found there, and that's highly unusual to find so many fossils in one location. And we created 3 investigations that are rooted in questions that our own scientists think about when they're working on in field sites. Again, tailored for students, something accessible for students. And our goal with each of these investigations is not to take kids to a right answer, but to give them an opportunity to uncover evidence that they can use in order to analyze that evidence and produce an argument that is in response to the question. And so our goal throughout these is to provide them with the supports necessary to practice critical thinking in a way that's aligned with their curriculum and is as authentic and collaborative as possible. So each of these investigations relies on students collaborating with one another. So I've put together just like a 1-minute screen capture that takes you through one of the investigations. So I don't have a pointer, but the one on the far left, what dinosaur did these bones come from? You'll notice after I hit play, wherever I do that on this piece, that the investigation starts off with scientist-led videos. Those videos are designed to provide modeling, background information, and direction for the investigation, and they pop up again throughout the investigation based on where we're hoping students are in their engagement or their point of the investigation, sort of helping them move from observation into evidence gathering, into analysis of that evidence, and ultimately into development of an argument. Not a particular argument, the one that their evidence leads them to. So what you'll see are those videos. You'll also see that we're using Autodesk's Remake software as our embedded 3D viewer, initially for students to make observations on the fossils that we've given them. And then further on in the investigation, they actually use viewers side by side to incorporate comparative analysis to try to figure out the type and species of dinosaur their bones belong to. And then each of these investigations has got on-screen supports that encourage these collaborative groups of students to engage in discourse about what they're finding, helping them to stay with their evidence finding versus rushing to the end with their ideas. Students are inclined to want to glob onto an idea very early on and then work to find evidence that supports that instead of asking themselves where their evidence is pointing them. We also introduce them to key vocabulary like being able to differentiate their evidence as strong, weak, or disconfirming. We provide embedded assessments. You saw at the end, we're also providing extension activities. So these are the component parts of each of these 3 pilot investigations and the basis for which we were trying to measure impact, so for critical thinking. Okay, so parallel to the development of that concept program, we were asking ourselves what the concrete processes were involved in critical thinking, what parts of critical thinking would we be working to support, and then also what would it mean to demonstrate critical thinking. And that led us to focus our attention on measurable processes for critical thinking and to better understand how students deploy these processes when they're using this program. To do that, we had to get specific on what we meant by critical thinking. So if you look in that far left-hand column, you'll see the critical thinking skills that we wanted to address with any of these pilot investigations and the supports that we wanted to provide so that students were stepping through each of these in a way that they were supported and could be successful. The development of those rubrics led to the development of a number of tools, surveys, pre-post, delayed post tests. We also used screencasting software to capture student movement on the screen. How did they interact in an interface? And that also captured their conversations while they were working on these investigations, which we've used to do verbal analyses. What else? I can't remember everything I've said so far, but observation tools, and we've analyzed the student notebooks, the things they've written. And then for today, what I wanted to focus on are the two bodies of data that have been most meaningful to us. And one has been the verbal analysis, because that's allowed us to look at our work and figure out where students are successfully engaging in these critical thinking skill processes, where they've been deployed successfully, and where they may be struggling. And that's helping us to see in the sequence of any investigation where we perhaps need to make improvements to the supports we're providing, perhaps slow students down, give them different prompts. And then we've used the pre-post and delayed post tests in order to see if we're moving the needle on critical thinking. For our measurements with our pre-post and delayed post tests, we were concerned with whether or not students could be metacognitive about what it meant to be a critical thinker, as well as their ability to deploy those processes I shared with you on the original rubrics. And in terms of metacognition, we asked items like this that measured a student's ability to generalize their approaches to critical thinking. And what we saw, so this data is all from this last year. I should mention that we've been doing this testing throughout the development of the program. And in this last year, we sort of agreed that this was our final iteration of these pilots, and we would do some final fidelity testing. And so the results are reflective. They've been consistent with what we've seen in prior years, but this is data from this past year. So let me point out that the orange bar represents, let's see, if you go back, this year we gathered data from 5,000 students, and those students were control group students and implementation students, or our test groups. The orange bar represents our control groups. The green bar represents part of our implementation group where we were teaching in the classroom with consistent implementation times and facilitation methods. And the gray bar represents classrooms where teachers were implementing research quests. There were some variants to, say, their implementation time, perhaps their facilitation methods. But we were really interested in seeing how students perform when implementation was consistent from class to class versus, variability by teacher. And so what we found with this particular item, this metacognition around critical thinking, was that both implementation groups outperformed control groups, both at post-test and delayed post-test. Now, I don't have pre-test on here, but there were equal sort of performance rankings for each of the three groups. But at post-test, they outperformed the control groups, and then we were really thrilled to see that at delayed post-test, there seemed to be some stickiness to this skill, and we didn't see as much shrinkage as we thought we might. In terms of deploying these critical thinking processes, we had items that assessed the student's ability to judge the sufficiency of evidence. So we had a number of items like this one up here, and I won't read it. I think you can all see this. Is that right? Can read these. To gauge whether or not students were able to apply these thinking skills in new situations. Again, our implementation groups outperformed our control groups in statistically significant ways. In questions that asked students to determine whether or not particular questions were likely to yield useful evidence, we saw, again, statistically significant progress in our implementation groups as compared to our control groups. And then this one was really interesting. This is something that, to Harry's point about unintended impacts, one of the things we really didn't discuss when we were setting this up, right? We were trying to move the needle on critical thinking. We didn't think at all about the impact of these investigations on teachers other than they were high-quality resources aligned with their curriculum that they could use with their students, tomorrow. And one of the things we found through our interviews of our fellows was that many teachers were becoming reflective about their own practice after using these resources, saying, I didn't realize how I was trying to save my students from struggle. They struggled with these investigations, but it was good. It was a really good struggle, and it made me realize that I was dumbing down science in many cases so that my students didn't struggle. And one of the things they liked is this component where we introduced this idea of strong evidence, weak evidence, and disconfirming evidence, and they continued that vocabulary beyond the investigations into other areas of their science curriculum. Again, our implementation groups outperforming our control groups. I'm not sure how I'm doing on time. Oh, time's up. I'm going to skip these slides and just say quickly we have takeaways, which I've pretty much covered in my comments, and then this is where we're headed. We're wanting to understand the features that were leading to critical thinking, understanding more about that object interaction that's happening with students, data mining, and building new quests. Thank you very much.
So before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge the Piscataway and other Indigenous peoples of this region whose traditional lands we're gathered on, as well as to acknowledge and celebrate the resilience of those peoples today. As Stephanie said, I'm neither Ricky Punzalan nor an information scholar. I'm an anthropologist. My name's Diana Marsh. Nice to meet you all. I'm going to do my best to fill his slot. We've been working together on kind of alternative impact models projects since 2013. And I have text confirmation that he's comfortable with me filling his slot today. Here at the Smithsonian, I'm working on a 3-year NSF-funded project to increase the use, access, and discoverability of the collections of the National Anthropological Archives where I work. We're part of the Natural History Museum, but also part of the Anthropology Department. If any of you are interested in anthropological collections, come talk to me. Today I'm going to be talking to you about 2 different projects that have kind of fed into that work I'm doing now. The first, valuing our scans. So this is the project we started in 2013. I'll talk about that first. And then I'm going to talk to you about a project I've been working on for about 2 years at the American Philosophical Society. So valuing our scans, as many folks have mentioned, digitization and online access is a key mission. It's a key space of engagement. For institutions with ethnographic collections in particular, digital access is part of this wider movement to collaborate, to incorporate Indigenous knowledge, to return knowledge. So it's a really important part of what big repositories are doing with Native communities. And the premise of this project in 2013 was that very little is known about the uses of ethnographic collections. When we say ethnographic collections, they're difficult to define, so that was one of the main challenges of the project. But in general, we're looking at collections that have ties to originating Native or Indigenous peoples in repositories. As Harry mentioned, we're looking at impact as an observable, positive or negative, especially with Indigenous collections. There can be negative impacts to digitizing or sharing things online. Changes or effects that wouldn't have occurred without doing that work. And influenced by a number of other information scholars in that definition. So what's unique about ethnographic collections? The range of formats and media and their sort of topical fluidity into other kinds of collections, possible restrictions to their use, the complex nature of their histories, the limited scale sometimes. So if you have one Native speaker left in a community, or you have a very small group of people working in a remote place, you can have huge impacts without having any kind of metric impact, right? And then we have this problem of the history of objectification of peoples. And so there's sort of a general resistance to using numbers or clicks or likes or any of these other kinds of numeric measurements to think about what we're doing with these kinds of collections. So I was a research assistant on this project. Rob Leopold is in the room, who was the other PI from the Smithsonian side. So we had managers of digital assets from the Smithsonian, as well as researchers on digital impacts from University of Maryland, including, in addition to Ricky Punzalan, Brian Butler and Massimo Petrozzi. And we did a series of site interviews and focus group discussions at 8 different institutions up and down the East Coast, and a workshop to talk about these issues. So some findings, some important findings, we confirmed that very little was known about what actually goes on with ethnographic collections in many of these institutions. But what we found that we thought was the most important nugget for us and what revealed a lot of gaps for future research was that stories were a more appropriate way to try to understand and capture and document what's going on with Indigenous collections in many of these repositories. And in addition, there was a real gap, partially because we went to largely white staffs at big institutions up and down the West Coast. There was a real gap in community understandings of what impact could mean. Harry mentioned what is the impact that we'd like to know? And it's important in this context to find out what do communities want to know? What kinds of impacts do they care about? Not just what impacts do institutions care about? And what impacts impact desires do we have in common? So the project that I started doing at the American Philosophical Society sought to sort of fill that gap. So it took the premise that stories were a legitimate and interesting and maybe more culturally responsive way of documenting impact. Who here has heard of the American Philosophical Society? Oh, this is a great crowd. This is very impressive. So for those of you who don't know, the American Philosophical Society is founded in 1743 by Benjamin Franklin and his buddies, and it's known as America's first learned society. Members of the society, there are still about 900 members. The papers of those members, when they pass on, have become part of the library collections of the society. So there's a very, very large archives and library there in Philadelphia. Something like 13 million manuscripts is a number that gets tossed around. They have things like the Lewis and Clark journals and a draft of the Declaration of Independence and those kinds of things. Lesser known to most of the public is that they have one of the world's largest collections of Indigenous languages, dating back to very, very early language collecting. Back in 2010, this project started at the Untitled Nation to use Thomas Jefferson's 1793 list of Untitled vocabulary that he himself collected with James Madison on Long Island to work to revitalize that language. So in part that, that spurred the foundation of a Center for Native American and Indigenous Research that's there now. And since then, they've been working on digital knowledge sharing partnerships to work with Indigenous communities who can use the language collections in the archives to work on cultural projects. So I got to the APS and was working as a curatorial fellow and used those relationships to try to think about how we understand Native perspectives on archival collections and their potential impacts. So the basic structure of the project was to do a lot of consultation in the first year that I was at the American Philosophical Society, obviously go through IRB, and then I've been doing a series of interviews. I'm just finishing up this fall and recruiting people through the various connections that I had through the APS. So just to give you a sense, this was actually a screenshot of an interactive we made for the exhibition I was working on that just gives you a sense of the kind of range of places that the American Philosophical Society has been digitally returning or digitally sharing its archival collections. So I drew on the exhibition relationships that I was building. These are 2 of our Native American advisors for the exhibition I was working on. And then I've been going to conferences largely in order to meet with lots of different kinds of people from different contexts to talk about these issues, as well as to do site visits. So I think this is really awesome. So this is TJ Holland and Benjamin Frey is a professor at Western Carolina University. And they're actually taking audio recordings from the APS collections that one of them had on their flash drive and just on the top of a pickup truck transferring them to someone else's laptop. So it's really interesting to watch how these archival collections are actually circulating in Indigenous communities and being shared and used, and how exciting that is for people. So as I mentioned, I'm doing a whole series of interviews and talking to lots of different people from different community contexts about their perspectives on what it means to them to have archival or other Indigenous collections shared in their communities. What are they doing with them? And that can be anything from developing curricula for immersion programs to working on building their own tribal archives. There are lots of different ways that people are using these, including working with artists, all those kinds of things. And then I'll be working on analysis coming up in the next year. So that's the basics of the project, and Ricky's also working on a project on the Harrington collections here at the National Anthropological Archives, so I'll make sure if anyone wants his email, I'll make sure to get that to you if you have questions about his project. So thank you so much.
We have limited time, and so earlier when we decided that we wanted to open it up to the floor for questions. So if you have questions, now's the time. Please.
It was more of a comment than a question, but I know that we've mentioned like broader access and diverse, and so I just wanted to really commend that project as far as like, because I know that a lot of artifacts and everything came from other places and then end up here, and I think it's good to start thinking about how to get different, to get resources in the hands of the people that were closest to them historically. So I think it's something we always keep in mind with all of the work that we do.
Thank you.
Other questions? Yes.
So, can you hear me? Yep. So the question's a bit about how you would maybe link stories and impact, because I think both Harry and Diana's were thinking within this framework where narrative is important. So if the two of you want to talk a little bit about what does that do to the way in which you think about impact, because I think a lot of times, certainly in interdisciplinary work, there isn't always an understanding maybe of measuring a story, and that's not what you're doing. But maybe to talk a little bit about some of the challenges that you face in that area.
Do you want me to start? Okay. So the paper that we wrote for archival science talks about trying to characterize different kinds of stories. So we looked at, are there stories that have maybe an institutional impact versus a community impact? Within those broader categories, are there stories that are really about impact to a couple of individual people versus a broader impact? Are they, and in the paper we've just written that is coming out shortly in Archivaria, we've started to break down the actual kind of content characteristics of some of those stories. So whether it's knowledge production, we even started looking at potentially in the future health and wellness as a category, artistic practices. So we've started looking at what are the different characteristics of stories or the types of stories, and trying to come up with almost like a typology of stories that we could then use to help us characterize what they mean and why they matter, and how we would translate that, for instance, to like granting agencies or other reporting in a more formal way.
Harry?
Yeah, I think it's there are two sides to this. One is just from a purely scientific perspective. You know, once you start pulling data apart, you're narrating, right? You're telling a story, because some parts of the data you're not showing, so other parts you do. I mean, that is a story in itself. I think the second part, and I think that relates to what you're saying, is what is the best way to transmit impact to the people, to the audiences that you want it to have impact on. Two audiences, one is, in your case, the stakeholders themselves, which I find very powerful, and apparently, which is very easy to understand. A story, they relate more to a story than to a bunch of data, right? On the other hand, you know, impact assessments would also should be useful for example, funders. You know, your funders want to know, I'm putting €1 in or dollars in, it costs money. You want to know what kind of impact it had. And I think one of the things we're really struggling with is how do we come away from trying to capitalize literally everything. You know, there's a big trend in Europe to say, okay, so the British Library, I mean, it costs a number of pounds to run it. How much pounds in return in the social capital does this have? And it very quickly becomes a very quirky story, right? That's what we're facing. So we've also experimented with film. because then you can see both the emotive side of the thing. In my case, people sharing their stories about the war, but then combining it with data. So, so many % of people say X or Y or whatever, and I think that there's a whole world to find there.
I'm just going to jump one more thing, which is that the project I've been working on at the American Philosophical Society, I've been asking people much more concrete questions about the formats of the media they're looking at. So are there particular affordances of, say, photographs versus audio recordings versus field books that have meaning in certain ways or more or less use in community contexts? And I think that is a more concrete thing that can help institutions prioritize what to digitize and what to share, knowing what the potential uses are in communities for those materials.
I think we have time for one more question. Anyone? No? I have one question that I'll ask. So given how different your projects are, tell me what success is for your projects going forward and how you're going to measure it. An easy question.
You want to start with that?
Mr.?
Sure. For us, I mean, I feel like it's a lot easier because we had a very specific goal in mind, and that doesn't mean that it's easy to measure critical thinking, but it became something to sink our teeth in. So I would say success for us moving forward is not only understanding whether or not we can move the needle on critical thinking in a measurable way, but if we can start to understand the component parts that help students deploy those processes so that we can replicate this and scale this program concept into potentially a library of many other online investigations that students across other grade levels can use.
Harry, did you want to add?
Yeah, again, a big question, but okay, so my organization, Europeana, we've been in the business of changing mindsets. I think that's the biggest thing that we've tried to do. I mean, yes, we have a data repository of things, but I think success for me would be, and maybe that is a call to people. I talked to Effie Capsalis a bit about this. Can we make sure that impact starts to outweigh this whole discussion about open or non-open? Once we're at that point, then I think my organization has really had success, and your organizations as well, I would say. Yeah.
With that, please join me in thanking the panel. Thank you.